thing with motion release, I'm not going to tell you what they are until I get to them for suspense. So, before that, I have 4 points of rebuttal. First of all, they question the model. Like, let's just make it clear. The model is basically the same kind of model that's applied to any referendum system of like a federalised system where you've got a state, okay? In situations where you have sectarian conflict based on region or ethnicity, Madam Speaker, we require both a majority result and a result from any groups that we perceive at risk of oppression, okay, Madam Speaker? So, like, that implicitly answers several questions that have already come out of it. First of all, we talked to Paddy, said, when are these elections going to happen? Well, we said we're aggressively pursuing them, Madam Speaker. The second we believe we can hold them, Madam Speaker, the second the guns have stopped firing, we will hold them. He then said, what about the risk that the violence starts up again? Well, we suggest, Madam Speaker, that perhaps the minorities that have been being shot at for the last several months might be risk averse. That this will immediately start back up again. They might be a bit hesitant to vote for ousting. Harish mentioned the risk of minority groups who were previously oppressing, being oppressed after we leave. Well, Madam Speaker, again, if that risk exists, they are also a minority group who are at risk of oppression, Madam Speaker. If they perceive that they will experience a backlash, they will vote against this as well. That's also important, Madam Speaker, because we currently don't believe that Western governments often do enough to protect minorities from retaliatory oppression, because they can get away with classifying abuses that are committed against those people as being their own fault. This gives those people at least some right, some check and balance to ensure that the West does its duty to protect all minority groups, all ethnic groups from racial backlash and racial discrimination post-pull-up. And we think that's an important check and balance we have. They talked about lying. They said, what if they just lie? This is the second point. Firstly, we say they already are, Madam Speaker. That's the problem. These insurgent groups do exist in communities. They do lie. They do turn communities against the insurgents. And more important, that's why what Ben said is so harmful. Because when they lie, Madam Speaker, they're able to make the public associate all of the ills that they experience, which are primarily because of historic discrimination, Madam Speaker, as being the fault of current oppressors. They are able to make it less likely that people on the ground actively investigate the previous systemic abuses that led to their discrimination and retribution, Madam Speaker, by just blaming current oppressors, okay? What this does is it forces us, Madam Speaker, to win those votes. It forces us to counter those lies with truth, Madam Speaker. It creates more information by placing pressures on us to provide it. I'm going to get to that more in my substantive. And more importantly, they had no answer, Madam Speaker, on resource wars. And I know resource wars are a bit of a debatory thing, but it's big, okay? Because they're just getting more important. Afghanistan just discovered £1 trillion in lithium. China owns 95% of the world's lithium. The US wants that lithium, Madam Speaker. The chance that it will be able to pressure Karzai for internal HR reforms to do its job, Madam Speaker, is infinitely diminished, Madam Speaker, when it has those perverse incentives. This places a check on balance on that. So my first point is going to be about institutions. They talked about fourth estate, blah, blah, blah. I'm going to explain why we have absolutely no capability of making those assessments versus the people, okay? First of all, how do we make decisions? First of all, we say there are just innate ties between culture and politics that we cannot separate ourselves from. Therefore, this creates biases in selection based on simply identifying differences as opposed to identifying differences that are meaningful in historic conflicts, Madam Speaker. We simply focus on identifying things that are different and removing them. We also say, secondly, that most of the experts we rely on are cookie-cutter experts who fly from conflict zone to conflict zone and build their careers on asserting certain systems of civil service progression, certain systems of ministerial deportation, and those have an incentive, Madam Speaker, to politically campaign for those things purely to preserve their own careers. Thirdly, in terms of our accountability to our own citizens, we think that's a bad thing. We think it means that it's exactly true. It means that our accountability isn't to the people who we are meant to be serving, but to us. It means that governments have an incentive to present to Western people a system that is similar to them. It means because Western people judge success based on what they have, because because of the innate sense of Western superiority over cultures that exist in conflict zones. It creates incentives for the West to show that they've made Iraq more like us and given them the balances that we have, without showing that those are important. What about the people, Madam Speaker? We think, I'll take you in a little bit, Reece. We say they just, first of all, in terms of information, what we think it's our duty to provide that information. In terms of the ability, Madam Speaker, we think these people have spent more time thinking about the underlying causes of their discrimination than anyone. For the same reason that I probably spent more time thinking about why I lost last year's Euros final than anyone. Because it's their experience, because they suffered as a result of it, and that focuses their attention on how to fix it in the future. Those are precisely the kinds of people that governments need to force into, need to get information from. Go.
Okay. Why would the Serbs in Kosovo, given that they're risk averse, as you yourself say, ever vote for US troops or NATO troops to leave?
The US government presents a system of checks and balances that it can convince those people who are at risk of that they will be protected from it, Madam Speaker. It's also just not true that people don't care about military involvement. It creates curtailments on their freedoms of movement, like random house searches. People do generally want systems to go, okay? So in terms of, it also creates incentives against, there are also incentives against the unnecessary revelation of public information. Why? Because some information creates short-term conflict but long-term benefits, okay? Things like TRCs, which may ignite things at the moment, but create greater institutional checks in the future. US government doesn't hold TRCs in Iraq because those kinds of conflicts create body bags being sent home to the US, and the US has a political incentive against that. This forces the US to communicate not just checks and balances and constitutional things, but to explain to the people why those things that are important. And that's fundamentally the most important part of any constitution. Technically in the UK, the Queen can command power. She doesn't, because the people in the UK recognise that that's bunkum. It's the people's understanding of the constitutional framework that is far more important than the components that underlie that in law. It also forces them, Madam Speaker, to explain why they conduct house searches, why they institute certain policies, Madam Speaker. They don't do that at the moment because they don't have to, because they don't have to leave the checking booth. They don't have to waste time explaining these things to civilians. This forces us to do that. That's a good thing.